Central 5, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this session on Made with Hydrogen, Engineering a Greener Industrial Future with Conhome in partnership with Cadent. So let me now explain what we're going to do. We have a distinguished panel of 4 speakers. Each of them will have a go for about 3 minutes. Then I will ask some questions, maybe for about 10, 15 minutes, and then it's over to you, because I'm sure you will have lots of questions to ask, and that is at least partly why you're here. And I will keep the introductions short. And the first speaker today is Dr. Angela Needle, who is the Director of Strategy of Cadent, whose network of distribution is up there on the left as you look. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Angela Needle. I'm Strategy Director at Cadent, and I'm also the Vice President of Hydrogen UK. And Cadent are a humble gas network, and we simply provide energy when you need it, all day, every day, and we do this almost invisibly. But I've got a few facts for you today. So the UK has the most extensive, safe and reliable gas network in the world. We have 285,000 kilometres of gas pipes delivering gas to 23 million homes and businesses. Instead of transporting natural gas, it can be used to transport renewable gases like biomethane and hydrogen. And don't forget, this is infrastructure that is already here, that you've already paid for. And we know how hard it is to get infrastructure delivered at this present time. And I'd like to say our sector is full of talented people working on the challenge of decarbonisation and shifting our energy infrastructure to net zero. And it's largely accepted that the future energy system is going to need at least 30% hydrogen in it. And that hydrogen is going to be used to power industry, to generate electricity, fuel transport, aviation, and potentially homes and buildings as well. And it has to work in lockstep with renewable electricity so that when it's not windy, we've got power and heat. And quite a lot of progress has been made by this government on the business models and standards. There's been competitions for funding. It does feel difficult to gain pace. Unfortunately, the Hydrogen UK's report this month has shown, sadly, we've slipped down the leaderboard when it comes to our position on hydrogen. And building this hydrogen economy is important from a growth point of view. And I feel it's actually simply due to the challenge of certainty. Certainty of what happens beyond 2030. We've got lots of 2030 targets, which are brilliant, but we do need certainty beyond 2030. We also need certainty that this government, or the next one, or even the one after that, aren't going to change tack. The energy industry takes years of planning and years of delivery, and the uncertainty could spook the horses. One of the things we do need, for example, is transport and storage of our pipelines that transports hydrogen. And the plan for this isn't going to be complete until 2025. So if you want to move hydrogen around this country, we need a plan a little bit quicker than that, I would say. So I just wanted to make this a little bit real for you, because it's not just about gas networks. It's really what's at the end of the pipe that is the most important thing. It's really about homes, about jobs, about growth. So I brought some props in. So my first prop is a tin of Tate & Lyle golden syrup. Now, my kids love this. I'm sure yours do too, right? On your pancakes. Tate & Lyle factories on the Thames, and they produce and sell this product worldwide. 1 million tins every month. Tate & Lyle need an alternative gas to operate their production, and they cannot electrify it. And they're looking at hydrogen to do this. They employ 850 people in the UK. Now, I had brought a glass bottle of Fever Tree tonic, but it was confiscated on the way in, because it was glass, even though this is made of glass, and I could hurl it at you if I wanted to. It was confiscated, so I apologise for that. Imagine this is tonic for your gin and tonic, which no doubt you'll be drinking later on. Nearly all glass bottles in this country are made at the NSERC factory in the northwest, and the Fever Tree tonic bottles are made there. NSERC have already tested making glass bottles from hydrogen in their factory, and they plan to be one of the first users of hydrogen on the HyNet project, which is a big northwest industrial decarbonisation project using hydrogen. Without hydrogen, all the infrastructure to deliver it, there will be no glass bottle manufacturing in the UK. 500 people are employed there. I'd like to say that your gin and tonic depends on hydrogen. And lastly, Beans. This is from the Heinz factory, not far away from here in Wigan. Produces over 1 billion cans of food a year and employs 850 people. Heinz plan to be one of the first users of hydrogen in this country from the HyNet project that I talked about. And there are heaps more companies too. Brick manufacturers, ceramics, cosmetics, food and drink, vehicles, cement, glass, and so on, even the ink for your newspaper. The companies in the northwest and around the country are relying on hydrogen. The industrial cluster project in the northwest, HyNet, the companies that want hydrogen from that project have an annual turnover of 10 billion and employ 345,000 people. That's only one of the reasons in the UK. So we might be a humble gas network, but people rely on our infrastructure to give them the future energy that's going to fuel their industries. There you go.
Thank you very much for that overview. I just can't get out of my mind your point about the glass bottles. The difference in the bottle and the glass. Anyway, be that way. Over to Alexander. Delighted to see you again, one of our most regular contributors to Con Home, on green issues over which we get a lot of submissions. Alexander, welcome and over to you.
Thank you very much. And for those that don't know me, my name is Alexander Stafford. I'm the Member of Parliament for Rother Valley, but also the chair of the Hydrogen APPG. Now, I often speak, as Paul has mentioned, on green issues and hydrogen in particular. And many of you would have been here last year and the year before and the year before that, maybe listen to my conference speech, of which I'm normally quite bullish about hydrogen, how the UK is a world leader, how we're leading the way, and there's a great opportunity. I think this year, though, my spiel will be slightly more downbeat, because I'm going to say truthfully, we are no longer, I'd say, the leading country when it comes to hydrogen. I would say, actually, we've missed a bit of the boat for that. And I think we're seeing this, if you look at the US's IRA investment, make it a far better place through hydrogen investment. The EU, in the State of the Union address, the President recently talked about attracting more hydrogen investment. So a lot of other countries and organisations, which were lagging far behind us in the UK a few years ago, have not only caught up with us, but at least overtaking us when it comes to ambition. And maybe a few years ago, I was going to say that hydrogen was almost that, as much as you can be silver bullets. I would describe it as the sort of the polyfiller of net zero solutions, the solution that fills all those gaps we have no idea how to fill. But clearly, as time goes along, we realise hydrogen, we've lost the race when it comes to EVs. For example, frankly, we're even struggling a bit now when it comes to home heating against heat pumps. But I still believe there's a space for hydrogen. I still believe there's an important space for hydrogen. I feel there's an essential space for hydrogen. And that, to me, is when it comes to decarbonising industry. As we already discussed, there's huge amounts of carbon still in our industry. About 16% of our greenhouse gases are in high-intensity industry, things like I mentioned, like steel, glass, brick making, where electrification is viable up to a point, but it can't. The heat's demanded for those industries you just cannot get with electrification. Likewise, CCUS could help mitigate using natural gas, but we need such large storage facilities, and still some of that technology is nascent. The only real solution, if we want to be seriously decarbonise our heavy industry, and we should be doing that, is through hydrogen. Now, one of the big problems we've got with hydrogen, frankly, is there's not enough hydrogen. When I speak to hydrogen companies, it's always chicken and egg. They're saying, we can't produce enough hydrogen because we've got nowhere to sell it, basically. And likewise, when I speak to a lot of the consumers or the industrial base, they say, we can't but get hydrogen, so of course we're not going to invest in hydrogen. So what we really need is the government really leaning in to saying, actually, we need to back hydrogen. We need to invest huge amounts of money already. They're already investing many billions into this, but even more to say, if we want to be serious about decarbonising heavy industry, we need to back it. Because nowhere else in the world has a solution for decarbonising heavy industry either. Hydrogen is the solution for heavy industry. And if we get there first and fastest and quickest at investment, we can then sell that product abroad. But we're not the only ones doing this. Now, recently, H2 Green Steel is a hydrogen-fueled steelworks in Sweden. They've signed a deal with IKEA to provide 12,000 tonnes of green steel. So IKEA in Sweden have already decided, right, this is the solution. And that's just one of the biggest examples at the moment. What we're going to see over time is that more and more big companies like the IKEAs of the world or other ones, we're going to invest in this. They'll find those small startup companies, those small hydrogen companies, say, make us the products, make us green steel. And we can actually do that. I mean, we still have a huge steel industry in the UK, like 1.7 million tonnes of steel are still produced in Yorkshire, where my seat is, every single year. So there is opportunity to lean into those jobs, lean into heavy industry if we get it right. But we must try and bring those costs down. And only with sort of government intervention to try and back this can we have that confidence. Now, I believe this government is confident when it comes to steel and heavy industry, but we just need to continue to make the message, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who make the message, that hydrogen is the solution. I'm frankly tired of people saying it's one of many solutions. For heavy industry, hydrogen is the only solution, the only game in town, I believe. And I think if this government, and we all put pressure on this government to invest it, we can have a happy, healthy, high-intensity manufacturing sector for many decades to come, built on hydrogen.
Alexander, thank you very much.
One person liked the speech anyway. That's what they published in my article on home.
I'd like to encourage you along. And next we're going to have Andrew, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of the Ceramics Confederation.
That's right, yes. So good afternoon, thank you. My name's Andrew McDermott, Deputy Chief Executive at the British Ceramic Confederation, the trade association for UK ceramic manufacturers. And in terms of ceramics, everybody knows our iconic tableware and giftware, and top marks to the Convention Centre for using UK-made tableware, Churchill China product there. So good to see that today. But that's just a small part of the sector. Sector also includes heavy clay construction products, so the products used to build our houses, so clay bricks, clay roof tiles, clay drainage pipes, sanitary ware, wall tiles, floor tiles, those sorts of things. Also, as well, the sector comprises refractories, which are the insulating materials for all high-temperature processes. So whether we're talking about steel, glass, cement, petrochemicals, thermal power generation, anything that's running at several hundred degrees, that requires ceramics to keep the heat in those processes. But that's not it. It also includes technical ceramics, so these sorts of things. Around about 200 electroceramic components in a mobile phone, jet engines, critical components of a jet engine are made using ceramic materials, biomedical applications, so things like artificial hips. So the sector is much broader than people realise. In terms of some facts and figures, turnover of the sector is about £2 billion, and we employ about 20,000 people full-time, and about 30% of what we make is exported. Now, the sector's energy intensive, about pre-energy price rises. The sector used somewhere typically 30%, 35% of costs were energy and climate related. Now that's more like 50%. So it's a huge cost. So anything we can do to drive down energy cost is paramount. We've got a long history of decarbonisation. So cast the clock back 20 years, turn of the millennium, then since then the sector's decarbonised by about 50%, and we're home to already some of the most energy efficient and carbon efficient manufacturing processes in the world. So now our carbon emissions are about 1.25 million tonnes, and about 2/3 of that is associated with firing our kilns. So that's where hydrogen comes in. It's at 2/3 of our emissions. Hydrogen is a solution for decarbonising. So according to our roadmap through to 2050, then hydrogen is the biggest lever we've got in terms of decarbonising. And so hydrogen alone could result in decarbonisation of about 35–40%, those sorts of things, just by using hydrogen. In terms of where we're at in terms of proving it, I'm currently leading a project, a £6 million project that's funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, and that's to prove the hydrogen firing of ceramics. So hopefully next year I'll be firing 3 real-life manufacturing kilns at 3 of our member sites using 100% hydrogen. So this time last year we had some pilot-scale products, some methane-fired bricks and some hydrogen-fired bricks, and thankfully didn't try and bring those in today because there's no way we would have got those through security. So yeah, that just kind of shows that it's a key part of our transition to net zero. So Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, Joe Milligan, who's the Head of Government Relations and External Affairs at Liberty Steel.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to Caden for inviting me to come along today. In some respects, I almost feel, all the speakers before me have basically set out the case for hydrogen. So I'm going to take a bit of an opportunity to obviously explain why for steel, for some of Liberty's sites, but for the steel industry more generally, hydrogen can be a real game changer, not just in terms of the sort of commercial and operational aspects of making steel and processing steel, but also for decarbonisation and also in ensuring that the jobs that exist just now in the UK in steel communities from Yorkshire to the Midlands to Wales to Scotland are viable and are there for the long term. So the role that hydrogen has to play in that is kind of twofold. One, as a fuel, as other speakers have mentioned, making sure that the sort of heat that gas provides just now for steel making and steel processing can be provided in a decarbonised form. But there's a secondary use that hydrogen could have in the steel making process, not necessarily for ourselves as Liberty Steel, but potentially for other operators in the UK and across the globe, and that's as a chemical reductant. I won't go into the technical details of that, not least because it stretches the bounds of my knowledge and expertise. But there are two ways in which obviously hydrogen can support the decarbonisation of steel making. And as we know, you can't decarbonise an economy without decarbonising steel. Every single energy transition, technology, transmission and storage product requires steel, from the piping through which hydrogen would flow, and Liberty Pipes Hartlepool has become the first UK producer and only a handful globally thus far to be accredited actually to be able to produce pipeline for hydrogen. And obviously everything in, as I say, sort of storage as well, whether that's battery storage, you'll require steel plate usually for the construction of those kind of devices. So obviously there's an opportunity to drive forward low carbon reindustrialisation in those areas, as I mentioned before, which have been industrial heartlands of the past and can definitely be low carbon industrial heartlands of the future. There's an opportunity for UK PLC. And that comes in the sort of research that McKinsey have conducted, which has identified the opportunity for manufacturing in the UK, low carbon production and low carbon products to contribute about $1/3 trillion between now and 2030. And obviously there is the opportunity that Alexander mentioned around leading R&D or once leading R&D and the sort of economic assessment in hydrogen uses and regulation. And we shouldn't lose that mantle that we've had previously as a country in being able to take forward the development of new technologies and especially new low-carbon technologies. And last but not least, supporting energy security and resilience. As Angela mentioned, energy earlier on, obviously it has a contribution to make in the energy mix of the UK and in providing that security that we all need, and everyone obviously will be sufficiently more aware of how critical that is post the Ukraine crisis. What I would say is there's some challenges and considerations for industrial manufacturing when it comes to hydrogen. Non-cluster manufacturing, so Liberty's main steelmaking and processing sites are in the heart of Yorkshire, as Alexander mentioned. We are not in an identified an industrial cluster area, our main steelmaking and processing. So there's a question of timing and scalability, development of networks, and ensuring there's a critical mass to make sure actually that the production is sufficiently economically viable as well. There's CapEx and OpEx considerations for industrial users too, so we would have to retrofit or replace some of our equipment to be hydrogen ready. And while there's different business models that government are supporting for hydrogen production itself, it's not as clear what support there will be for industrial manufacturing in terms of being able to support the purchase or, as I say, retrofitting of our equipment, and especially those who don't have electrification options. Not all equipment has technically hydrogen equivalent ready yet, so there's a consideration there as well around, again, timing and kind of scalability. And then there's the security of supply question for industrial users as well, which comes back to the business model and the amount of support and the types of support that the taxpayer and government will provide to help sort of de-risk the investment that's required to make sure that the volumes are available from for a commercial and operational point of view from industrial users. And then last but not least, and obviously one that is always contentious, is around planning. There'll be infrastructure required. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that one there. I'm sure there's enough commentary in the room around planning.
Indeed, there will be. Thank you very much. Planning's one of the questions on my list to ask. But let me just try and start by looking at the scene broadly. Alexander, you gave quite a sort of bearish presentation of where you thought the government was, and quite a bullish presentation in terms of what you thought hydrogen could do. So I wanted to ask you about what the Science and Technology Committee said last December. You may tell me their report's been superseded, but they said their kind of little headline conclusion was not a panacea, can grow to become a big niche fuel in particular sectors, likely to have a specific but limited role in decarbonising sectors, not likely to be practically and economically viable for mass use in the short and medium term for heating homes. Somewhat more downbeat in my reading than what I thought you were saying at the end of your remarks. What did you think of their report, and what's your response?
Well, I think I'm not criticising it fully because they are right, but it's interpretation. To me, 16% or decarbonise 16% of our industry, or 16% of our country, is huge, and we've got to think more globally than this. And this, unfortunately, sometimes is the problem with MPs. We're quite parochial about our own little area, our own little country. It's a great country, but we're one small part of carbon emissions across the world. When we're talking about, brick production in China, or decarbonising ceramic industries in India or the like, there's a huge global market. And what is actually important is that if we get it right in the UK, and when it comes to industry, there is no other solution to decarbonising, mass decarbonising hydrogen. We can export this technology, these solutions, around the world. And if you say to me 16% of decarbonisation is not big enough, well, no, it's a good amount. The amount across the globe is essential. And actually, one thing I want to slightly correct you, the government has been actually quite good when it comes to the noise they make on hydrogen. And actually, Rishi's, the Prime Minister's recent announcements around net zero, I think actually, slightly slowing down some of the rollout of things, it actually plays very nicely into hydrogen's hand, because hydrogen is that solution which gives people more choice than electrification. We're not telling people anymore that you have to have your heat pump, that you replace your boiler. You can put blending in. It actually opens up more opportunities. So I'd say the Prime Minister's recent announcements on net zeros actually enable the hydrogen sector even more and are much more to welcome than when we had before.
And if the government's been quite good, why have we fallen behind, which was your first observation?
Well, I think we've had to prioritise things and see what works and what doesn't work. I mean, we've got to be realistic. No one wants to... people are a bit scared sometimes about being leaders and being the first one to do it and get it wrong. But I say to the government, I know the government is doing this, is if we can't be the first to roll these technologies, let's be the best. And my conversations I am having with the government is they are looking and they're learning from other countries, other examples. So it doesn't matter if you're the first, as long as you're the best eventually, that's what matters. And I do think this government is backing the best for the future.
Anyone else on the Select Committee? No? Just a question for anyone to answer, really, just in very simple terms. There have been lots of references to government support and all that. What's hydrogen looking for in terms of support, in terms of the bill? How much is it wanting government to invest, to spend, to subsidise and all that? Does anyone have an estimate of the total number of emissions that would be saved if the investment comes in? And how many jobs, how much profit will this investment produce? Anyone?
Sorry.
Why don't you,
it's fine.
as someone in the front line? It's nice.
Yeah, I'd say for ceramics, it's the key decarbonisation technology. So, as I mentioned, the roadmap we've recently revisited. It was the key technology. 36% of the decarbonisation that we need to meet to hit net zero is associated with hydrogen. Not having hydrogen makes it kind of pushes us down the electrification route. And for ceramics, that's it's difficult to envisage, just because one of the advantages of hydrogen is that you're swapping one gaseous fuel, methane, for another gaseous fuel, hydrogen, so it allows you to retrofit to existing kilns. So that's one of the reasons, kind of one of the key aims of the project that I'm looking at the moment, is to prove it on existing kilns, that you can retrofit it. If the hydrogen's there, we can use it. With electrification, you've got different heat transfer mechanisms. So you've got much more radiation, much less convection. It sounds quite techy, but what that means from a practical perspective, if you're firing bricks are currently fired in stacks, which are about 1.5, 2 metres high, something like that, and that traverses through the kiln. In order to do an electric firing, you wouldn't have stacks, but you'd be firing bricks at one layer high, so individual layers of bricks going through the kiln. So the kiln would look radically different. It'd be a complete redesign of the kiln. Would have a much bigger footprint, and also thinking about how you get that volume of electricity into certain semi-rural locations where our factories are, some of our brick factories are located. They're often located close to where the raw materials are extracted, so quite rural locations, and getting that sheer volume of electricity to these sites seems quite a challenge. So for us, hydrogen is it's kind of the key technology that we need to develop. And if you don't get it? So if we don't get it, so the 20,000 jobs that are in the sector, that's the sort of order of magnitude that we're looking at. So it's not just about those jobs, it's about what comes next, like reshoring. Can we grow that base?
Yes, I've got lots to add here.
Yeah.
So what does the hydrogen sector need to get going? So we need a business model that supports hydrogen producers, so that those who buy the first hydrogen aren't penalised for buying hydrogen over natural gas, because natural gas is cheaper. So that is currently in the energy bill. We are still waiting for it to be, pushed through. We expected it in springtime. The delay is the problem, right? Because people are waiting to put final investment decisions in place on the basis of certainty. So certainty and getting the things that have been put into policy through is really critical. The second thing that we need, as well as those who are planning to make hydrogen to get going and flipping make some, is how do you get it to where it needs to go? So in order to distribute the hydrogen, you've got to have some pipelines and some storage, because you can make hydrogen when it's windy, and then you can put it somewhere and save it for when you need it. And the storage business model and the pipeline business model is not in place yet, and isn't planned to be in place until 2025. So, and these aren't complicated things, particularly. And by the way, our government is great at this. They're great at doing it properly. Unfortunately, it takes a long time, right? So we're trying to sort of be perfect at everything. And so I would like us to be a bit more fleet of foot and put something in place that is broadly right and iterate as we go rather than perfect. And it seems to me that we're trying to put perfection on a plate in relation to all the policy and legislation that sits around hydrogen. Now, I agree, it's got to work. It's got to save carbon emissions. And that's why the government has put in place a standard, which means you cannot make hydrogen and get support for it unless it is low carbon. So some really good things, but it feels like it's nearly there. It's just not quite, we've not quite pushed the ball over the edge of the hill.
Just on the really good things point, one of the first things you said, and you've just echoed it just now, was business hates uncertainty. Yeah. You want certainty. Did you feel the Prime Minister's speech on net zero last week was helpful in that regard or not? Because a complaint from bits of businesses, hey, we're all set up and ready to go, and now he's moving the targets.
He didn't say very much about it. In fact, he didn't mention hydrogen at all. So, you pick up the phone then and go, are you still on for this hydrogen thing that you've been talking about? Because he didn't mention it. And so not mentioning it doesn't mean he doesn't want to do it anymore. I'm sure it's on the, I know it's, all systems go.
Yeah.
So, but it does create uncertainty if it's not absolutely clear. Yeah.
And we were having a conversation just before this event took place. I want to bring in Joe here because you mentioned this particular point about storage. And certain forms of hydrogen require capture and storage, and you need to do it on a large scale. And that means running into the exigencies of the planning system. Politicians in the planning system, these days it tends to work rather slowly, as we've seen with housing. So I'd be very interested in anything that any of you have got to say about the role of planning, where you think the government and Parliament is in relation to it, and whether you feel optimistic or pessimistic about it.
Go on, you go first, I'll go.
Can I just go through one practical example, if that's okay? We're talking about the infrastructure for hydrogen, but let's also look at the infrastructure for electrification. The village I live in, Hart Hill in South Yorkshire, is currently being basically closed. There's 3 entrances and exits to the village, 2 of which have been closed for about 4 months because they're running high voltage cables from a motorway service station for electric vehicles through the village. And this is just one small village in South Yorkshire, so we get a few more fast rapid chargers at the Woodall services. And that's just one. And if that disruption is happening up and down the country for electrification, using, let's say, existing pipes, and we can use quite a lot of the pipe network for hydrogen, is actually going to be a lot less disruptive. I think we all appreciate going to net zero, there's going to be some level of disruption. But actually, by going to more hydrogen-based solutions than electrification, is going to be far less disruptive overall. So I don't think it's going to be disruptive, not disruptive. We're going to have disruption. What is going to have the minimal disruption? And I'd say hydrogen would have less disruption than electrification.
Sure.
2 things. Let me just very quickly come back to the point before. There are some of our processes as Liberty Steel where electrification is possible and actually desirable. There are others where electrification is not possible. For example, we atomise metal into a powder that can be used in a 3D printer. The kind of heat that you need to be able to do that, electricity will not be able to provide you with that. So for some processes, hydrogen is the only way to decarbonise those processes. Coming to the planning point, as Alexander said, there is a much bigger and a much more mature conversation that needs to take place, and politicians representing individual constituencies have got a key role in this, actually. This is about leadership, and this is about the conversation about net zero and industrial decarbonisation, which is all of those, environmental and economic and security and social benefits. And actually, that is a conversation that all politicians of every colour and every shade need to be having with the general public in this country, because there are going to be trade-offs. There are going to be, for example, I'll use an example, sorry to use another energy provider. Octopus Energy had a scheme called Plots for Gigawatts, where they had a database of people who purchased energy from them, but who had indicated that actually they would be willing to consider having energy generation assets in their local area, as long as they were able to get some benefit from being the place where those energy generation assets were. If we look at what's being considered in terms of, electricity reform, electricity market reform, there's an understanding that it cannot be the case that the future of this country is that, most of the electricity is generated in and around the north of the country, whereas actually there's a huge amount of distribution and therefore other infrastructure that requires to run throughout the whole of the country as well, and again brings into play all sorts of questions around security of supply and around cost. So there is a mature conversation that politicians of all colours in this country, sorry, I mean red, blue, yellow and green there, need to have with the general public about the trade-offs, the limitations, the upsides and the downsides.
Andrew, do you feel optimistic about getting a mature conversation about planning out of Westminster?
Well, I mean, it's going to take a bit of effort, but
right.
What I would say, and I agree with Alexander, planning for hydrogen is different from planning from electrification. But let's be absolutely clear here, we need both in spades to get to net zero. This isn't a fight between electrons and molecules. We need a lot of hydrogen and a lot of electrification. So planning is going to be needed regardless. But what I would say is that majority of things like hydrogen storage, the salt caverns are not that far away from here that are already storing hydrogen. There is most of the places that you would store hydrogen will be offshore. So the kinds of big infrastructure that you need for hydrogen is largely offshore rather than onshore. So from that point of view, it's a slightly different planning conversation.
Andrew, anything on planning?
I think the panellists have covered most of it. It's key. It's clear. How are you going to, if we're talking about electrification, how are you going to get the volumes needed to some of these fairly rural locations to run these industrial processes? It's just difficult to see how you can get the quantity required to power those processes. So absolutely, planning is going to be key within this. Mentioned also as well about grown-up conversations. I think cost is a key one in there. We need to be honest about the cost of this, and also as well, I think we also need to be clear about what are we looking at. A lot of the discussion and the debate focuses on territorial emissions, the emissions that the UK generates within its borders, not so much about the consumption emissions, what UK citizens and companies consume, and that's the real impact. So we need much more honesty and discussion about consumption emissions as well as territorial emissions, because looking at consumption emissions, you can see a lot of the apparent progress is due to offshoring of emissions and industrial manufacturing being offshored abroad. So absolutely all that feeds into to a much broader conversation.
And Angela and Joe and Andrew, I mean, you will all be going, or your firms will be going, or your alliances will be going, I assume, to the Labour conference. So what will you be telling Labour shadow spokesmen and Conservative ministers this week about what you want to see in the party manifestos as the general election draws nearer?
So for me, talking from a steel point of view, it's that kind of whole systems approach. So it's not simply about, is there a business model that works for producers? It's then about the impact in the supply chain of all of these different policy issues as well, when you're going to be a consumer of that new type of energy. And obviously it is about thinking about the supply chain too. So I talk about Liberty Steel as a potential consumer of hydrogen, but as I mentioned earlier on, we're also the first accredited producer of the pipeline required for hydrogen and carbon capture in this country too. So it's about a more holistic and whole system way of thinking about how we utilise the opportunities and how we deal with some of the challenges.
Angela, so in addition to that, do you feel you're getting support from sort of local Conservative and Labour, I suppose, mayors and local authorities?
Yeah, I mean, we have quite a lot of support across the spectrum, because they see that we're looking at the transition from fossil fuel to hydrogen. How do you go about doing that, or to biomethane or other low carbon gases, and how do we do that in a way that works for everybody? But let's be really clear, we will not get to net zero without some hydrogen. Right? Regardless of whether how much you're going to use hydrogen for, you're going to need it to balance the electricity system, for starters. When it's not windy, you're going to need hydrogen. So I'm hoping it's a party neutral topic. And a huge amount of progress has been made on the various business models and things. The last thing that we need is a pivot to some other new novel way of doing things. We've put quite a lot of effort into creating as a framework that we've got. It needs to be perpetuated. And the thing that we really need to take into that sort of Labour conversation would be targets beyond 2030, because 2030 is round the corner for us. When you're building infrastructure, it takes tens of years. So if we don't know what's going to happen targets-wise beyond 2030, in terms of the support that we'll get, that's very difficult to plan for.
Andrew, and then...
Yeah, I think from a ceramics perspective, the clear message is we need a long-term industrial strategy. So whether you call it a strategy, whether you call it a plan, is for how industry is going to decarbonise, the enablers that are required to do that. We need to maintain international competitiveness at all stages of the decarbonisation journey. So we need to have not just decarbonisation and staying internationally competitive, because there's no point in, we still need the products. So if we are not competitive, we'll get squeezed out, and instead of low carbon UK manufactured goods, we'll be importing higher carbon products. probably manufactured much more carbon intensively, and then you've got the extra carbon in terms of shipping them across. So for us, kind of it all boils down to having that long-term industrial strategy. How can industry decarbonise and stay internationally competitive without just pushing emissions abroad, which is a false economy?
And Alexander, just finally, which ministers will you be talking to about the manifesto, and what do you want to see in it? Will you be going to Kemi Badenoch, or do you go to Claire Courtine? Do you go to the Treasury? I mean, how many departments do you have to go around?
The main one is obviously Claire Coutinho, obviously the new Energy Secretary of State. But also, I think, in some ways, I'll be quite honest with you guys, it's not election winning or losing issue, hydrogen. It seems actually, for politicians, relatively uncontroversial. All sides, both us and Labour, but I don't know about the Lib Dems, but don't really care, don't seem to back hydrogen. There might be some disagreement about how quickly or slowly they do it, but it's not a controversial issue. Everyone is backing it, and frankly, it is irrelevant because we are going to win the next election. So whatever we decide is going to happen after the next election.
On that cheery note, it's time for you all to come in. So I'm going to take two questions at a time, and I will ask, naturally, for people who want to ask questions to identify themselves. So who wants to... Okay, I'm going to take the gentleman in the front row and then the lady in the green at the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. Very simply, you mentioned...
Sorry, then you...
Julian Gallant. I'm the Conservative Group Leader on Ealing Council. And it's a question, you've despondently mentioned we're behind technically. Who's so far ahead, and why is that internationally?
Why not? Yeah,
just very quickly, at the moment, technology we are still ahead and we still have a good lead. It's the investment and the money, and I think the IRA in America has changed the game when it comes to anything. We cannot compete with them, but even Europe has woken up now to invest tens of billions into the project, so we just need to put some more money in.
Could I just say very quickly on that, some of the decisions that have been made over the last couple of years in the sort of industrial decarbonisation area, so for example, reform of the emissions trading scheme, we're seeing some of these stick, to incentivise greater investment. I think the point is the balance isn't quite right yet in terms of the carrot. In terms of that decarbonisation, and again, right across different, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's about carbon capture and storage, we'll see what manifestos bring by way of introducing a few more carrots to the conversation.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Jennifer Powers from Meld Energy. We're a green hydrogen developer here in the UK. Given that electricity is 70% plus of the production cost of green hydrogen, how does the panel feel about how we manage to keep hold of our industry here in Britain by bringing down the price of electricity to be competitive with, because Britain does have very expensive electricity compared to the rest of the developed world. And ultimately, that would require not just 15-year contract for differences under the hydrogen business model, but potentially tens or hundreds of billions of subsidy for very many years. So given that the price of hydrogen is not going to fall as quickly as, say, the price of offshore wind because of technological advances, how do we actually bake in the long-term success of hydrogen by bringing down our price of power?
Who wants to go first?
I'll just very briefly, I think we need to treat hydrogen, and when it comes to our industry, as national security. What we saw happened with Ukraine and obviously Russia. We need steel making, we need ceramics, we need things as national security. The only way to decarbonise them is hydrogen. Ergo, we need to make that as a national security issue. And then suddenly the game changes about subsidies or tax incentives.
I was just going to say sort of two words in some respects further faster. The price of electricity right now in the UK, you're absolutely correct, it's difficult to compete if you are consuming a lot of electricity in your processes. But actually, if you look at the prices that have been agreed through contracts for difference in recent rounds, at a point in the future, the UK, and I think we're beginning to see some of that in terms of some of our European equivalents, The UK will actually be producing will be producing electricity that costs significantly less than obviously is having to be paid for now. And there's it's a conversation in of its own right, probably require several days. But actually the number of proposals that exist just now around reform of the energy markets in the UK as well, shifting some of the costs from electricity to gas, and again coming back to flaring, for example, in gas production is about to be brought within the scope of the emissions trading scheme as well. So a lot of the costs that have existed on electricity previously in order to pay for the development of renewable is going to begin reaping those rewards quite soon.
I think I'd just add to that as well, that the cost of electricity in the UK for industrial electricity is the highest in Europe. So it makes it very difficult to electrify processes. So that's a key consideration. But also looking at hydrogen as well in terms of how we fund that. It's key that we don't repeat that same mistake, because a lot of the costs for decarbonising the power grid, those have been put onto industrial consumers. So that's kind of one of the primary drivers why industrial electricity is so expensive in the UK. Looking across to hydrogen, we don't want to repeat that mistake of lumping costs onto industry, which makes us uncompetitive, and therefore we just see those jobs, the value, the carbon emissions go abroad, and we just import the products. It really is a false economy to do that.
So there's a difficult question here, because if the costs don't fall on the industry, the costs have to fall somewhere else. The costs therefore presumably fall on the taxpayer. It's a fight to get the investment, isn't it?
Yeah, just to add to this, and I suspect you might know the answer to this, really, is that obviously as wind power increases, we're actually paying to curtail wind when we don't need it. And so if you can have a mechanism that allows excess wind to be used to make hydrogen at cheaper rates before you use the electricity network, because the electricity is going to stay high to consumers because of the cost to balance the electricity system. And something needs to step in when it's not windy, and we have to pay for that. And so your kilowatt hours that you pay for includes of all of that altogether, whereas when the wind price is going to come down. So I think there's some changes in the market mechanism needed to enable hydrogen production from lower cost wind to, to benefit from that, and obviously to reduce curtailment would be good as well.
Who wants to come in next? There's a hand there, and right at the back. Yeah, So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sai Karthik Madabushi. I'm the Deputy Chair for North West London. I had a question on hydrogen capacity. We talk about introducing hydrogen into electrifying our grid, maybe even a potential solution for commercial transport. So do we, by 2030, will we have enough capacity to cater to the country's needs?
Yeah. Yeah, why don't you shout?
And I can do this too. So a lot of talk, obviously, about international competition. I wanted to ask about collaboration, because obviously today the CBAM comes into effect in the EU and is obviously likely to affect a lot of the industries we're talking about. Are there opportunities to collaborate? Because obviously with our low carbon price at the moment, we might end up being punished by a CBAM. And I just want to get views on whether or not there's something we can do about that, whether it's through ETS linkage or something else.
Right, who wants to?
Could I maybe just tackle that one? There is a complication for manufacturers in the UK who might wish to export some of the goods to Europe now that the EU has introduced the CBAM. And obviously, the UK, we're waiting for government decision on whether the UK is going to introduce one or not. However, because our carbon price is low right now, it hasn't been historically since introduced. Actually, it spent more time above the EU's price than below ours. Then what UK producers looking to export goods from the UK to the EU might face is having to make up a price differential. However, why pay for all of your production at the higher cost when you only have to pay all of your production at the lower cost and then what you want to export to the EU at a slightly higher cost? I would have thought that actually the economics of that work out in favour of UK manufacturers. Now, that'll depend on products, that'll depend on some of the benchmarks, and without getting into all the sort of detail and the minutiae of what the EU are trying to do. But fundamentally, the intent is to drive sort of carbon costs, I suppose, across the world when it comes to trade, and to make sure that there's a sense of a level playing field where those of us in the UK, Europe and other jurisdictions who are looking to decarbonise are not having to compete unfairly with jurisdictions where they don't have the same kind of regulation, the same kind of carbon costs associated with their production. So I think it's a bit of a bogus argument that we need to necessarily pay the higher cost that the EU is currently having to pay in its carbon costs for all of our production in order to not be penalised for a small amount of what we might sell into the EU.
I think as well there's a second point, irrespective of the carbon price and the carbon price differential, then if you're exporting from UK into the EU, you've got a huge admin burden now. So you're already reporting under the UK ETS, and then you'll be reporting again for your exports under the EU ETS stroke CBAM. So there's a huge admin burden there that a company, irrespective of what the carbon price is, of whether it's higher or lower. So that's another key factor. So how do you do that? How do you kind of maybe link the two schemes? Are you then kind of part and parcel of the of the CBAM? These are kind of all big questions that need to be thrashed out.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to answer. I was
Quite
going to move on. Is that okay?
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Will we have enough hydrogen by 2030? No, I don't think we will. So the government's got a 10 gigawatt target, 5 from green, 5 from blue. We need lots more than 10 gigs to meet all of the industry's need. And again, I'm not. The government's done a good job getting this all going. We still haven't got any of that hydrogen production, happening. But beyond 2030, 10 gigs is nowhere near enough. We need probably 5 times that. And so the problem I have is that we've focused on these industrial clusters, which are great because they're where the big intense carbon dioxide production is from industrial process, but also need for hydrogen. But there are industries, to Joe's point, and I live near the steelworks in Sheffield, up and down the country, where there are not part of a cluster. Brick manufacturers and others which won't be able to get access to hydrogen within that time frame. So the plan and the certainty that we're looking for is how do these things join up so that you've got reliability within the hydrogen production, and how do you make sure that those industries that absolutely need it, if they can't make enough hydrogen on site, and people will be able to make hydrogen on site, but also that they can access some kind of a hydrogen network.
And buy pipe from Liberty Pipes, Hartlepool.
Yeah, no, I just completely agree. It's not enough. We're not producing enough. And in some ways, we could produce, I would say 5 times. We could do 10 times than that because we could sell it. And that's what the more green hydrogen we produce, the better it will, because the world needs it. And once again, I want to say this conversation should not be about the UK and UK industry. It should be about global industries and what we can do with it globally. And that is how we need to think about things. We're too parochial sometimes when it comes to decarbonising. We need to think how we fit into the wider global picture and what we can do as the expertise here in the UK.
Okay, so probably the last two, if there are 2 more. There are one. There's a gentleman there, and then, yes, there.
Hi, Krish Rangaraju from Stratford-upon-Avon. My question is very much, do we see in the industries of ceramic, steel, and glass, will we see a productivity benefit or disbenefit if we swap to hydrogen?
And, yeah.
Hi, Adam White. I'm from Burgess Hill, which, as you may know, used to be, back in the day, a big brickworks manufacturing area. Anyway, a lot of my questions have already been answered this afternoon, which is absolutely great. But elephant in the room here, green hydrogen is really what we need, or maybe a push pink hydrogen. But we need to plaster our countryside and with solar panels and wind turbines to make this happen. So that's got to be in the mix somewhere.
Right, who wants to?
This is the first question. It's a wider debate, frankly, about solar farm, wind farms, especially when it's solar on. I'm against solar farms on productive arable lands, waste of land. But there are places to put solar panels which can be used. Likewise, wind turbines. There are time and a place for it, especially offshore, as we discussed. So I don't think you have to consider, if you have hydrogen, you have to plaster the countryside with solar panels or wind turbines. It's all about sensitivities of where you put them. And the North Sea is a great, still untapped asset when it comes to wind. On the question about productivity, I'll leave it to some of the others to answer that. But there is a cost if we don't change to hydrogen. And the cost is the end of those industries in the UK. So you have to go. It's as simple as that.
Anyone? Productivity or in production?
I think with decarbonisation, you're going to have linked to that much more automation, much more machine learning, those sorts of things. So there's going to be a greater demand for technical skills, for engineering skills, for science skills. So that's all going to feed into productivity and kind of how you get those roles covered. So absolutely, I think STEM subjects and focusing on STEM is going to be a key part of this.
I just very quickly agree, both in terms of AI's usage in manufacturing. It can certainly help with optimum processing, for example, both from an environmental point of view as well as from an economic point of view and as well as from an energy use point of view, so whether that's hydrogen or another energy usage. And actually just the upskilling of the workforce as well tends to, on a human level, sort of motivate, which in of itself usually brings about sort of greater productivity and that kind of calculation of productivity. And just very quickly, don't forget tidal as well in terms of the North Sea and its ability obviously to produce some from tidal.
I think it's all been said. So from a productivity point of view, from the gas performance point of view, I don't think hydrogen increases the amount of glass bottles that NSERC can make, for example, but they have tested 100% hydrogen in their glass bottles and they meet all the standard requirements, which is good. When you burn hydrogen, it does produce water, you see. So you have to make sure some of your processes might need to be changed. However, I am not representing NSERC here today, but they have done a lot of work on their processes. In terms of will we need more wind turbines and solar panels, we're going to need a lot more anyway. What we just want to make sure is when, though, in the middle of summer we don't use as much electricity in this country, so why would you not make sure that energy is used to make hydrogen?
Well, thank you very much. And it's been a fascinating panel for me because on the one hand there's what government does and the speed at which government moves and all the issues wrapped up with government like planning and whether you can get the green supply, and on the other hand you've got the businesses around the table asking for certainty and asking what they will do if the hydrogen is not there in the timescale that they need. So it's a really interesting challenge and discussion. I'm very grateful to Angela and Alexander and Joe and Andrew for being here, and to Cadent, and ask you all to express your appreciation to the panel in the usual way.